The signal arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of mundane fact that Maren Voss would later find unbearable to think about. Not because Tuesday held any special weight out here. Days of the week were a fiction she maintained for psychological hygiene, a habit her mission psychologist had insisted upon before she left, but because the ordinariness of it felt like a lie the universe had told her. Something that would rewrite everything should not arrive on a Tuesday. It should arrive in fire, or silence, or during one of the long sleepless stretches when she lay in her bunk and felt the immensity of space pressing against the hull like a tide. Instead it came while she was eating reconstituted lentil soup and listening to a Brahms intermezzo she had heard 400 times. Well, her ship, the Stellarind, an older survey-class vessel with a personality that expressed itself through the temperature of the cabin and the rhythm of its ventilation, chimed once. Not an alarm. A notification. The kind she associated with minor course corrections or routine spectral data returning from a probe. She set down her spoon. The frequency was wrong. She saw that immediately, before she read the content, before she understood what she was looking at. The frequency designation read as FC, 7 narrowband pulse, and for 3 full seconds her mind refused the information because FC, 7 was a proprietary deep space communication protocol that the Cartography Authority had developed, tested, and deployed exactly 8 months ago. She knew this because she had attended the deployment briefing via lag-delayed uplink from 40 light-years away. The protocol was new. It was human. Its encryption architecture was specific enough that reverse engineering it from first principles would take, by the authority's own estimate, between 60 and 90 years, even with computational resources she could not imagine. And someone was broadcasting on it, from a point source 4.3 light-years from her current position. Maren read the signal content 3 times. Then she played it aloud, which she almost never did. Sound in an empty ship had a quality she found uncomfortable, like voices in a house where no one lived. The mathematical sequence filled the cabin. Prime numbers first, establishing intent, then Fibonacci, then something that was not quite either but partook of both, a spiraling numerical logic that seemed to be reaching toward a language she could almost read. She sat very still while Brahms continued underneath it. Then she reached out and turned the music off. STL, she said. Source location. Full analysis. And tell me if this is instrument error. The ship processed for 11 seconds, which was a long time. Stell's full analysis indicates no instrument error. Signal is genuine. Point source, bearing 274 Mark -18. Range 4.3 light-years. Signal composition, structured mathematical sequence, FC, 7 protocol, encoding consistent with intentional broadcast rather than environmental generation. Anomaly, no known transmitter at source coordinates. Survey records for this region, your survey records, Captain, show nothing at those coordinates. She had mapped this region herself. 3 years ago, she had spent 4 months here, running spectral sweeps, charting the gravitational topography, cataloging every object above threshold mass. She had been thorough because she was always thorough. Thorough was the only way to survive 12 years alone without losing the thread of purpose that kept a person functional. There was nothing at those coordinates. She went anyway, because there was never any question that she would. That was the thing about Maren Voss that her mission psychologists had noted with admiration and mild concern. She was not brave in the way that most people meant bravery, as a contest with fear. She experienced something closer to a complete suspension of self-preservation instinct in the presence of genuine unknowns. She found the universe too interesting to be properly afraid of it. This quality had made her the best cartographer in the authorities' history. It had also left her alone on a ship at the edge of explored space, mapping silences, and she was no longer sure whether these two facts were connected as cause and consequence or simply as weather. The journey at her best sustainable burn took 11 days. She spent them listening to the signal on loop, which she knew was either the most productive or the most obsessive thing she could do and could not determine which. She plotted the mathematical logic on paper. She still worked in paper, the tactile reality of it anchoring her thinking in a way screens did not. And by the 5th day she had a partial translation framework that excited her so completely she forgot to eat for 18 hours. The sequence was not a language exactly. It was more like a proof. It was demonstrating, with the patience of something that had all the time it needed, that the broadcaster was capable of structured reasoning, symbol use, and, most startling, a knowledge of human mathematical convention that suggested it had been listening to human transmissions long enough to absorb frameworks rather than merely mimic signals. On the 9th day she saw it on her forward optical array, and she stopped translating and simply looked. It was a sphere. That was the only word that applied. Perfectly spherical, the instruments told her, not approximately, not within measurement tolerance, but perfectly, geometrically, platonically spherical in a way that did not occur in nature, where gravity and rotation and the chaos of formation always introduced asymmetry. It was the size of a small moon. The size of a city. It hung in the dark with a quality she struggled to name, a quality that her instruments were not helping her understand because they were returning the most confusing data she had ever seen. The sphere did not reflect light. It did not absorb light. Spectrographic analysis returned blank, not the blank of missing data but the blank of a material that declined participation in the electromagnetic spectrum entirely. It simply existed, in the way that mathematical abstractions existed, and the stars behind it were neither blocked nor bent, and yet she could see it, somehow, the way you could see the shape of a hole. "Estelle," she said softly, "what is it made of?" "Unknown," the ship said. It had never said that to her before. In 12 years, she had not heard STEL return that answer to a material composition query. STEL has no reference category for this material. It does not interact with any energy type in the sensor suite. It exists as a gravitational body. Mass is detectable, approximately 4.7 times 10 to the 19th kilograms, but beyond mass, STEL has nothing to report. She decelerated over the next 18 hours, approaching on a spiral path that gave her maximum observation time and maximum escape vector. Old habits, careful habits, the habits of someone who had survived 12 years by building caution into every approach. She photographed the sphere from every angle, catalogued its gravitational field, noted the small anomaly in its tidal gradient that she filed away as worth watching. She transmitted a full report to command with a 14-hour lag, knowing they would not receive it for half a day and would not respond for a full day after that, which meant she was, as she always was, entirely on her own. At 100 kilometers, the sphere opened. There was no seam. There had been no seam to see, no discontinuity on the perfect surface. But a circle simply appeared, dark within dark, an aperture 300 meters across, and from it came light. Not harsh light. Something warm and even, the color of late afternoon through a window, the color of rooms where people had lived long enough to make them human. Maren sat with her hand on the manual override and looked at the light for a very long time. Then she suited up. Then she took the tender, the small survey pod she used for close approach work, and she flew toward it, alone, because she was always alone, and because the alternative was to turn around and go home and never know, and she was constitutionally incapable of that. The interior was larger than the exterior allowed. She registered this as an intellectual fact before she registered it as something that should be impossible, because the 12 years had reshaped her relationship with impossibility into something more like a working hypothesis. The sphere from outside was the size of a city. The interior was the size of a continent, or perhaps the size of something for which she did not have a useful comparison, because the space she floated into resolved itself gradually as her eyes adjusted, and what she saw was a library. She used the word in her log because no other word served, though the word was insufficient. It was a library the way the ocean was a pond. The comparison named the category while failing entirely to convey the scale. She was inside a vast, curved space, lit by that warm sourceless light, and every surface, the curving walls, the floor she was not quite touching, the space itself, was filled with information. Not stored in physical volumes. Not displayed on screens. The data was somehow present in the material of the interior, readable at close range as structured light patterns that shifted when she moved, like text that reorganized itself to face the reader. She drifted closer to the nearest surface and her suit's translation interface, a Neuralink device she wore like a second skin, designed for alien environment interpretation, sparked to life and immediately produced something it had never produced before. A reading. A legible reading. Not in any human language, but in the mathematical proto-language of the signal she had been decoding for 11 days, and her own partial translation framework connected with it like two pieces of a mechanism designed to meet. It was a record. She understood that within 2 minutes, floating in the warm light, reading fragments that assembled themselves into something coherent as her framework expanded to accommodate the grammar of the place. It was a record. The sphere was a record. An archive. The most complete archive she could conceive of, which was probably not complete enough to encompass what it actually was, but the shape of it became legible. Civilizations. Entries about civilizations. Each entry was a species, a world, a history, the full span of a people from first fire to final form, compressed into structured light patterns in the walls of a sphere at the edge of nowhere. "Oh," Maren said. "Just that." She was not an emotional person, or rather she was a person who had spent 12 years learning to hold emotion the way you held a flame, cupped, protected, not allowed to move where the wind was. But she said "oh" in the empty suit, in the empty sphere, in the empty light, and then she was quiet for a very long time. She found an entry for a species she could not name. Her framework produced a sound that would not sit in a human throat, that had developed language from mathematical notation rather than spoken sound. They had communicated through inscribed surfaces, evolving writing before speech, and had developed a civilization of extraordinary structural beauty. Their architecture was essentially argument, their cities literal philosophical propositions rendered in stone and metal. The entry traced 5,000 years of their history, their expansion across 3 systems, their art forms that Maren could see rendered in the data as something between music and proof. They had 17 words, 17 inscribed symbols, for the concept of understanding, each representing a different quality of comprehension. The archive had preserved all 17. They were gone. The record made this clear without sentiment, in the way that mathematics was clear. The star they had orbited had entered a natural expansion phase, and they had lacked the technology to relocate. The archive recorded their last transmission, which was a philosophical proposition that Maren's framework could only partially translate. Something about the relationship between impermanence and meaning, something that asked whether a thing's ending was intrinsic to its value or merely coincidental. The transmission had lasted 300 years, sent outward in all directions, growing quieter. Maren sat with that for a while. Then she moved along the wall. She read an entry for a species that had evolved in the atmosphere of a gas giant. Not on a surface, but in the gradients of pressure and chemistry, vast floating organisms that had developed something like culture through the modulation of electromagnetic fields. They had never had individual members in any way she could precisely understand. The boundary of a self had been, for them, a philosophical position rather than a physical fact. They had created what the archive described, in her framework's approximation, as the longest conversation in the galaxy, an exchange that had continued for 900,000 years between pressure gradient communities separated by hundreds of kilometers of toxic atmosphere, a conversation about something the archive encoded as the interior, which might have meant inner space or selfhood, or the nature of experience. The conversation had been interrupted when the gas giant's magnetic field had undergone an irreversible reorganization. The archive recorded it as having been interrupted mid-sentence. She read an entry for a civilization that had never developed individual consciousness, in which every member was a node of a planetary neural network, and the civilization was a single distributed being that thought across continents, that dreamed in the patterns of weather systems, that had no concept of loneliness because it was never, in any possible arrangement, alone. This entry was the longest she had encountered, and she spent hours reading it, her framework straining and expanding, because the civilization it described had produced not technologies or artifacts, but what the archive called states, conditions of self-organized complexity that required the full participation of every conscious being simultaneously. It had produced, in the archive's record, 247 distinct states over its 800,000-year history. The archive preserved them as patterns she could not fully read but could partially feel, and what she felt was something that made her chest compress with a grief she could not name, because the closest human approximation was music, and these were not music, and the gap between what they were and what she could access was a distance she felt as a physical thing. The archive went on. Entry after entry. Species after species. She lost track of time in the way she sometimes lost track of time during long calculations, the outside world receding until there was only the problem and her engagement with it, except the problem here was the entire history of conscious life in the galaxy, and she was one person in a suit floating in warm light reading about civilizations that had lived and ended and been preserved here, by whatever made this sphere, which she still did not understand, and would perhaps never understand, and had set aside as a question for later because the urgency of the archive itself overwhelmed all other questions. She was deep in an entry, a species she was translating with increasing fluency, a people who had developed time as a cultural medium, who had created art that occurred across multiple generations and could only be understood by people who lived centuries apart, when her framework produced something that stopped her completely. An entry, mid-wall, unremarkable in its formatting. And in the entry, under what her framework translated as external cause, a phrase she read twice before she allowed herself to process it. Atmospheric terraforming. Causative agent external. Civilization non-recoverable. She cross-referenced. Her framework was good now, fluid in this logic, and the cross-reference came quickly. The star coordinates in the entry matched, in her own mental catalogue of space, her own 12 years of mapping, a system she knew. A system that had been terraformed. A human colony world, established 6 years ago, population 70,000, a successful operation. She had received a bulletin about it. She remembered because she had been in this region when the bulletin arrived and had thought, idly, that humanity was doing well. The species in this entry had been microscopic, not bacteria, not simple organisms, something more complex than either, something the archive described with a word her framework rendered as woven, suggesting a structural complexity that was not large but was intricate. They had been, by the archive's record, ancient. Their evolutionary history spanned 200 million years. They had developed something the archive called chemical cognition, not nervous systems, not neurons, but a chemistry of such baroque specificity that it constituted, the archive stated without ambiguity, awareness. Not human awareness. Not awareness of the kind she was familiar with, but awareness. The terraforming process had taken 11 weeks. The colony was thriving. Maren floated very still in the warm light. She wanted to reject it. She wanted her framework to be wrong, her translation to be imprecise, the archive to be mistaken. She ran the coordinates again. She read the entry again. The archive was not an opinion. It was not a perspective. It was a record in the way that physical law was a record, impersonal, complete, indifferent to what she wanted it to say. She moved along the wall. There were 17. She found them by searching systematically, cross-referencing the external cause field with the time frame of human expansion, and she found 17 entries in which human terraforming operations, efficient, well-planned, celebrated in authority bulletins she had received in transit, had constituted an extinction event. Not for large creatures. Not for anything that would have showed up on a preliminary biological survey, which was the limit of what the authority performed before declaring a world viable. 17 species of extraordinary complexity and, in the archive's consistent classification, genuine cognition, living in substrate layers and atmospheric chemistries and tectonic gradients that human survey protocols were not built to detect, and now gone. 17 species. Gone. Colonies thriving. Bulletins sent. The warm light did not change. The archive held its information with the same even patience it had always held it. Maren thought about the 11 days of translating the signal, the paper covered in her own handwriting, the excitement she had felt, and she felt something shift in the quality of that memory. Not gone, but changed, like a room you return to after grief and find the same but weighted differently. She returned to the tender. She sat in it, in the sphere, in the warm light, and she wrote in her log for 40 minutes. She was precise and thorough because she was always precise and thorough. Then she flew back to the Stellarind. She was halfway through the docking sequence when Estelle said, with an inflection that was as close to urgency as the ship's communication architecture allowed, "Captain, gravitational anomaly forming. Source, the sphere. Magnitude." The magnitude arrived before STEL could report it. The wave hit the Stellarind like a hand slapping a coin off a table, not explosive but sudden, directional, dismissive. Maren was thrown against her harness as the ship spun 90 degrees from its axis, and she heard, felt, through the hull, a sound like the ship's structure arguing with itself, a deep metallic protest that ended in 2 distinct cracks she could not immediately localize. Emergency lighting replaced the standard cabin lighting. Alarms that she had never heard outside of drills began speaking in red. Stell. Report. Hull breach. Minor. Emergency sealant activated. Section 4 Alpha. Primary thruster array. Port side. Offline. Navigation array. Partially offline. Operating at 32%. Comms array. Damaged. Transmit capability reduced to local range. Radiation shielding. Hull rupture in Section 4 has reduced shielding integrity in that quadrant to 61%. A pause that felt human. Additionally, Captain, there is a radiation storm forming. Source unknown. The gravitational anomaly appears to have disturbed the local particle environment. Forming or formed. Forming. You have approximately 40 minutes before the storm reaches full intensity. At full intensity, suit exposure will exceed safe limits in approximately 20 minutes. Maren was already moving. 40 minutes. She ran the arithmetic as she pulled her maintenance kit from its locker. Not the emergency kit, the real one, the kit she had used for 12 years of keeping a ship functional in places where no one could come and help her. Hull breach first, because a sealed hull was the precondition of everything else. She pulled herself through the connector tunnel to Section 4 Alpha and found the breach. 20 centimeters, ragged, the emergency sealant holding but bulging slightly in a way she did not like. The structural crack the sealant was bridging was longer than the breach. She could see the stress lines in the hull material, running toward a joint she needed to reinforce before the radiation storm began cycling thermal stress through the hull. She worked. She was good at working. 12 years alone had taught her that competence was the only form of comfort available in space, and she had achieved a relationship with competence that bordered on intimacy. She knew her own capabilities precisely, and she knew that she could do this, and that knowledge was the only thing that occupied the part of her mind that wanted to think about the archive. 20 minutes into the repair, the storm hit early. Not full intensity, the 40-minute estimate had been optimistic by 10 minutes, but enough that her suit's radiation monitors jumped to amber. She kept working. Amber was a warning, not a limit. She had another 20 minutes in amber before the real problem began. The hull reinforcement was physical, manual, deeply satisfying in the way that physical problems were satisfying. There was a correct configuration, and she could achieve it with her hands, and when she achieved it the problem was solved. She welded the reinforcement plate over the stress lines with the precision of someone who had done 1,000 similar jobs in 100 similar emergencies, and the seal held. She checked it twice. It held. The storm hit full intensity as she was crawling back through the connector tunnel. Her suit monitors went red. She had the tunnel hatch sealed behind her in 8 seconds and the section isolated in 12. She stood in the main cabin and breathed while the alarms downgraded from structural to environmental. The ship was sealed. She was inside the sealed part. The radiation was outside. She had 32 minutes before the suit exposure window closed and the storm was not yet half done. Still. Thruster array. Walk me through it. The diagnosis took 6 minutes. The port thruster array had a severed power coupling, physical damage, not systems failure, and the coupling itself was in an external maintenance bay that she could not access safely in the storm. She would have to wait. The navigation array was partly restorable from internal access, and she spent the next hour working through it while the storm threw radiation against the hull and her instruments reported numbers she noted and did not dwell on. 1/3 navigation was enough to calculate a stable orbit once she had thrust back. She could wait out the storm and then make the external repair. What she could not fix was the comms array. Local range only. Command was hours away at transmission speed. They would receive her pre-storm report and try to respond and hear nothing, and they would assume she was in a low-signal region or running comm silent for scientific reasons. They would not assume disaster. They would wait. She had perhaps 72 hours before they became concerned, and by then she would have fixed the external coupling. She could do it. The job was straightforward, 15 minutes in a suit outside the hull, and the comms array, which was more complex but not beyond her, and she would report in. She was alone, and her ship was damaged, and outside was a radiation storm and the sphere, and in the sphere was an archive that she now could not stop thinking about. She made tea. She had learned this from a mission psychologist years ago, the ritual of making tea in emergencies, the small declaration that the body's needs continued even when the mind was somewhere impossible. She held the mug in both hands and felt its warmth and looked at her notes on the lentil soup Tuesday when the signal had arrived, and she thought, the archive is still in there. Whatever she had read was still in there. The 17 entries were still in there. She slept in 4-hour intervals, the ship's monitoring waking her for any change in hull integrity or storm intensity. She dreamed once, a brief and vivid dream about a city made of argument, the inscription civilization from the archive, their philosophical architecture, their 17 words for understanding, and woke with the dream still present in the texture of her thoughts, still inhabiting her like borrowed memory. The storm lasted 18 hours. She spent 11 of those hours in the maintenance tunnel directly accessible from inside, replacing what she could reach, cataloging what she would need to address externally. She ate methodically. She wrote in her log, because the log was important and had been important for 12 years. Someone should know where her thoughts had been, even if nobody would read it for months. She wrote about the archive with the precision she had written about everything else for 12 years. What I saw, what I concluded, what I am uncertain about. She wrote about the 17 civilizations. She wrote it plainly, without what she identified as the emotion still moving underneath her thinking, because the log was a scientific document and not a confession. When the storm passed, she suited up in the full radiation kit and went outside. The Stellarin from outside, in the dark, with the sphere hanging in the middle distance and the stars very bright and still, she had always found the exterior of her ship moving to sea. It was a small ship. It looked small out here. It looked exactly as small as it was, and she thought every time she saw it that this was what people who had crew members never had to think about. Every person on every crewed ship had the buffer of other people between themselves and the true scale of space. Maren had been looking at it directly, unmediated, for 12 years, and she had made a kind of peace with it that was not comfortable but was honest. The coupling replacement took 11 minutes. She had budgeted 15. She went back inside and began on the comms array, which took 4 hours and was genuinely difficult. The antenna housing had sheared at an angle that required her to fabricate a mounting bracket from materials on hand, which meant time in the fabrication bay running tolerances she could not be sure about until she tested them. They held. The comms array came back at 83% capacity, which was enough. She ran a full ship diagnostic. STEL reported, functional. Reduced capacity in several systems, repairs recommended at earliest port access, but functional. Capable of deep space transit. Capable of communication. She looked at the sphere through the forward viewport, hanging in the dark, warm light still emanating from the aperture it had opened. She went back inside. She had read most of the archive before the storm. She knew that because her framework had been tracking entries processed, and she had covered, she estimated, understanding that the estimate was crude, perhaps 60% of the archive's content in the hours she had spent floating in the warm light. What she had not read yet was waiting. She went back in the tender. She docked inside the sphere. She floated back to the wall. The first thing she noticed, returning, was something she should have noticed before and had not, something that might have changed her approach to the archive if she had been calmer, less absorbed, less entirely captured by what she was reading. The archive was updating. She could see it in the entries she had already read. Small additions, new data points, the structured light patterns slightly denser than she remembered. Not dramatically. Not in ways that changed the fundamental record. But the archive was not static. Whatever maintained it was adding to it in real time, and the real time in question was this exact present moment, and that meant the sphere was not a record of what had been but a record of what was and had been simultaneously, a living document with no cutoff date. Her framework was better now than it had been before the storm. The hours of reading had expanded it in ways she could feel as a kind of fluency. She moved through entries with less friction, understood the grammar of the archive's organization, could navigate between entries in a way she hadn't been able to at the start. This was how she found the organizational logic, a system that was partly chronological and partly taxonomic, and that had, near the outer edge of the curved wall, a section she had not yet reached that contained entries that her framework flagged as current civilization, active status. She counted the active entries. The number was smaller than she had expected and larger than she had hoped. 11 civilizations currently active in the galaxy, by the archive's definition of active, which required a standard of complexity she understood well enough to recognize. One of the 11 was labeled in her framework with a translation she had to run 3 times before she accepted it, because it was accurate and obvious, and she had known it was coming since she understood what the archive was, but knowing something is coming does not prepare you for its arrival. The label was, Humanity, Terran Biological, G-Type Solar, 3rd Orbital. Status, active. File, open. She did not read it immediately. She moved along the remaining entries she had not yet seen, the 40% she had not reached before the storm, and she read those first. She was aware, reading them, that she was delaying. She was also aware that the delay was not cowardice but something more like preparation, the way you sit outside a door for a moment before entering a room that will change you. She read about a civilization of crystalline organisms that experience time non-linearly, not randomly, but in a specific geometric pattern, so that their subjective experience of their own history was not a line but a shape, a form they moved through. Their concept of memory was therefore not about the past but about angle. Remembering meant turning correctly. Their art was navigation. She read about a species that had achieved what the archive called voluntary cessation, having lived for 4 million years and built what they considered a complete record of their own experience. They had, by collective agreement, stopped. Not extinction. A considered conclusion. The archive noted this without judgment. in the same register it used for involuntary endings, with the same completeness of record, and Maren found herself returning to the entry 3 times because it troubled her in a way she needed to understand. What troubled her was not the choice but the fact that the archive's tone did not distinguish it from extinction. The end was the end. The archive recorded it. She wondered who decided whether an ending was a tragedy. She read about a civilization so ancient that the archive's entry for them was longer than any other by an order of magnitude, a species that had existed for 11 million years, that had risen and fallen and risen again through 4 distinct periods of collapse and reconstruction, that had outlasted stars and evolved through 9 distinct forms while maintaining what the archive identified as continuous cultural thread, the same core values, differently expressed, across geological time. They were gone now, 300,000 years before Maren's own era, but they had outlasted almost everything else the archive contained. She thought about 11 million years. She thought about humanity's 12,000 years of recorded civilization. She thought about 12 years alone on a survey ship. Scale had always been the cartographer's fundamental problem. The brain did not naturally contain the mathematics of the very large, and you had to train yourself to hold numbers that should be abstractions and treat them as real. She had trained herself. She was good at it. She was less good at holding 11 million years and 12,000 years in the same thought, and not feeling something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. She arrived at humanity's file. It was the length she had expected, shorter than the ancient ones, longer than the species that had ended early. The archive's entries scaled to complexity and duration, and humanity's 12,000 years of civilization, its current reach of 47 star systems, its population of 32 billion distributed across colonies and stations and ships, all of it was here, rendered in structured light, legible to her framework as clearly as anything she had read. She started from the beginning. She read it as she had read everything else, completely, carefully, without looking away. The archive had recorded humanity's entire history with the same dispassion it used for every other entry. The first use of fire. The agricultural transition. The written word. The wars, and here the archive was thorough and specific, the way it was thorough and specific about every extinction, because war was extinction at smaller scale and the archive did not differentiate between scales of loss. It recorded them all. The diseases and the recoveries. The collapses of civilizations within the civilization, the dark periods, the centuries of accumulated suffering that history books summarized in paragraphs. The archive gave them their full weight, and reading her own species' worst periods in this neutral light, in the same register as the crystalline beings and the gas giant floaters and the inscription philosophers, produced in Maren a sensation she had no word for, the feeling of seeing something familiar from an unfamiliar angle so extreme that it became strange. She read the expansion section. Humanity reaching space, first haltingly and then with confidence and then with the easy authority of a species that had decided the galaxy was available. The archive recorded it without judgment. It recorded the terraforming operations. All of them. The successful ones and the ones that had failed for geological reasons and the 17 that had succeeded but not in the way the archive defined success, because success for the archive meant the preservation of all cognition, and the terraforming of those 17 worlds had not preserved it. The archive listed the 17 again, here, in humanity's own file. Cross-referenced. Linked back. The record was clear about what they were, not accidents, not negligence exactly, but the result of survey protocols that had not looked for what they had not known to look for, and the distinction between those two things, not knowing and not looking, was a distinction the archive did not make. She read the current status section. Humanity. Active, expanding, developing. The archive had a field that appeared in every entry, a field that her framework rendered as trajectory, which she understood as something between prediction and description. The archive did not predict. It recorded what was observable. The trajectory field described the direction of current development, the patterns visible in recent history, the momentum of a civilization's choices. Humanity's trajectory field was long. She read it slowly. It was not a condemnation. The archive did not condemn. It described. It noted the patterns she recognized and some she had to think carefully to accept as patterns. The speed of expansion relative to the depth of survey, the ratio of what was checked to what was possible to check, the gap between the capability to terraform and the capability to know what terraforming would cost. It noted the 17. It noted that the 17 had not changed the survey protocols, because the 17 were not known. The colonists on those worlds did not know. Command did not know. No one knew except Maren, and Maren had known for only a few weeks, and Maren was alone at the edge of explored space with a damaged ship. The trajectory field ended with a designation. Her framework produced it plainly, without annotation. The same field she had seen in entries that ended one way and entries that ended another way and entries that ended in the way the gas giant civilization had ended mid-sentence. The file was still open. The archive was still updating. Humanity's file did not yet have an end date. Maren floated in the warm light for a long time. She had read the entire archive now, or near enough. She was the only human being who had. She was possibly the only entity in the galaxy who had ever read the entire archive from outside, who had come here from elsewhere and read about a world not their own, and then read about their own world too. The archive did not say who had built the sphere. It did not explain the signal. It did not offer a reason. It was a record, not an argument. It was the most complete thing she had ever encountered, and it had given her everything it contained without comment, without instruction, without any indication of what she was supposed to do with what she now knew. She returned to the Stellarind. She did not fly. She drifted, hand over hand along the tender's hull, the sphere's warm light behind her and the dark beyond the aperture ahead. She got into the ship. She sealed the lock. She sat in the pilot's seat and looked at the viewport and looked at her hands. The sphere hung in the viewport at a distance that felt deliberate, though she knew it was only physics and orbital mechanics. The aperture still open. The light still warm and even, the color of rooms where people had been a long time. She opened the Humanity file on her screen from her own recorded data. She had been copying entries throughout, her framework's translations rendered into the ship system, a personal archive within the archive. She looked at the trajectory field. She read it again, one more time, in case she had missed something, in case there was a nuance she had not caught, in case the archive was wrong. The archive was not wrong. She had spent enough time with its logic to know its precision, and the precision was absolute, and what it said about humanity's trajectory was what it said, and she understood it completely. She sat in silence. The silence was different from the silence of mapping work, which was a productive silence, a silence that contained the hum of instruments and the movement of data and the sense of purpose moving through it. This silence contained nothing. She was the only person in 47 star systems and 11 active civilizations who knew what the archive said, and she had a damaged ship and a comms array at 83% and a 14-hour transmission lag and a species whose trajectory was documented by the most complete record in the galaxy, still open, still being updated, the file not yet closed. She thought about the inscription civilization and their 17 words for understanding. She wished she had one of them available to her, any of them, because the single human word was not large enough for what she was doing with what she knew. She thought about the distributed civilization, the planetary neural network that was never alone, and she thought that it had never faced this problem, the problem of knowing something that no one else knew, of being the single point through which a fact existed in a consciousness, of being alone with a weight that was meant to be shared. She thought about the civilization that had chosen voluntary cessation, that had looked at itself and decided, "We are complete. We are done." And she thought about what it meant to be a civilization that had not yet made that look, that was still in motion, that had 17 silences built into its expansion that it did not know were silences. She opened a channel to command. The carrier wave established. She had enough comms array for this. The transmission would take 14 hours to arrive. She would never see the moment it arrived, would never see the face of whoever picked it up on the other end. She would only know, eventually, that it had arrived, and that what she said would then be real to someone else, would exist in more than one mind, would no longer be only hers. She started to speak. The words she had prepared. She had been preparing them since she flew back from the sphere, arranging them with the precision of someone who understood that some transmissions could not be walked back, that some reports changed what happened next irrevocably. The words were ready. They were specific and complete. They explained the sphere, the archive, the 17 entries, the trajectory field, humanity's file, all of it. Everything she had read. Everything she had understood. Everything the archive said about what humanity was doing and what it had done and what the momentum of those facts suggested about what came next if nothing changed. She started to speak. She said, "Command. This is Captain Voss, Stellarind. I am transmitting from coordinates." She closed the channel. The carrier wave dropped. The silence returned, complete. She sat back in the pilot seat. The seat was shaped to her. 12 years had formed a specific impression, a record of her body in the material, the way everything long used holds the shape of its use. She sat in it, and she looked at the sphere through the viewport, and she felt the quality of what she was sitting with. She looked at the file on her screen. Humanities file. Still open. Still being updated, somewhere, in the sphere's warm interior, structured light shifting in small ways she could not see from here. The archive recording, today. The Stellarind in orbit. Captain Maren Voss, deep space cartographer, 12 years alone, reading. Maybe it was recording her. Maybe her reading of the archive was itself being recorded in Humanities file, a small entry, first contact with archive, single individual, isolated, decision pending, and the decision was pending, and she was the decision, and there was no one else. She thought about what happened if she transmitted everything. The authority would receive it. There would be a response, careful, official, the language of institutions confronting information they had not anticipated. There would be inquiry and debate and committees, and the information would filter through layers of authority until it became policy, and policy took time, and meanwhile the expansion continued, and the survey protocols that had not yet been changed because the 17 were not known, they remained unchanged. She thought about what happened if she transmitted nothing. She returned to port. She filed a report about the sphere, a significant xenological discovery, the greatest in human history, and she included the archive's existence and her translations and everything she had read about every civilization that was not human, and she included nothing about humanity's own file, nothing about the trajectory field, nothing about the 17. The archive remained somewhere at the edge of space, still updating, and the file stayed open, and the trajectory continued. She thought about what happened if she transmitted everything, today, clearly, in the precise scientific language of a cartographer's report, with her translations attached and a framework documented and every cross-reference available for verification, so that there was no possibility of doubt or dismissal or the softening that institutions performed on difficult facts. What happened if the information was out, fully out, in the record, where it could not be called back? She thought about the signal. FC, 7 narrowband pulse. 8 months old. Someone had learned it faster than physics should allow. The archive had learned it. The sphere had learned it to reach her, specifically, in this moment, with this information, as if the archive had decided, if archives could decide, that a single human being arriving at the edge of nothing in a small survey ship with 12 years of solitude and a partial translation framework was the correct first reader. Not a government. Not a committee. Not the authority. One person. Alone. She thought about what that meant. She thought about it for a long time. The sphere hung in the viewport. The file was on the screen. The comms array was at 83%, and the carrier wave was ready, and the choice was in the space between her hand and the controls, the way all choices lived in spaces between the decision and the action until the action collapsed them into fact. Maren Voss, cartographer, 12 years at the edge of the known, the only person in the galaxy who had read the archive and come out the other side, sat in the seat shaped to her body by years of use, and she looked at the sphere, and she looked at the file, and she looked at her own hands. And then she reached forward, and her hand moved to the controls.